All right, in this video, there's a lot to say. I'll try to keep it brief. There's just 3 slides, but there's actually a lot to say, especially in the last slide. So let's just keep it simple. Basically, what we're saying here is remember that when we have those 4 possible outcomes for a hypothesis test, half of them or 2 of them were errors, right? So the question is, what's the likelihood that they occur? Obviously, it's not half of the outcome, so therefore 50% probability that they occur. No, that's not correct at all, right? Turns out the correct decisions are going to be far more probable than the incorrect outcomes, right? So we're going to make it very difficult to commit the type 1 error by setting a limit or a tolerance on it, right? That limit or tolerance for the type 1 error, we're going to call the significance level, right? So we're going to say, hey, look, if we say that we're testing the hypothesis at a 5% significance level, we're saying we don't want to commit the type 1 error more than 5% of the time, right? That's going to be our tolerance or our limit, right? We're going to say, hey, we don't want to have it happen more than 5% of the time, so let's make the significance level 5%, right? Now, we worry about the type 1 error more than the type 2 error, so we're going to fix some limit on the type 1 error, and we're going to let the type 2 error kind of fluctuate. Okay. So the role of the significance level then is basically this. For a one-tailed test, the probability of the type 1 error is less than or equal to the significance level, right? So if we set the significance level at 5%, then it's going to be a 5% or smaller chance of committing the type 1 error. And why do we say 5 or less? Because depending on what the true mean is in that scenario, the likelihood of a type 1 error could be different, right? But it won't be any more than the alpha level. So if you set the alpha at 5%, it'll be no more than a 5% chance that you commit the type 1 error. So the alternative hypothesis, it uses less than or greater than when it's a one-tailed test, right? Because the less than is left-tailed, greater than is right-tailed. So the probability of a type 1 error is at most alpha in those circumstances. When the alternative hypothesis uses a not equal to sign, it means it's a two-tailed test. And for a two-tailed test, the probability of a type 1 error is equal to alpha, right? So it's not less than or equal to alpha, it's just alpha, right? So if you have a two-tailed test and you set alpha at 5%, then you have a 5% chance of committing a type 1 error when you run the test. Okay, so you may be thinking to yourself, well, if we want to avoid the type 1 error and the significance level sets a limit or sort of a bound on that, then why don't we just make the significance level really small? Well, okay, it's a good idea to make the significance level something like 1% for sure, but there's a consequence of that. If you drop the significance level to 1%, you're going to make it more likely to commit a type 2 error. Let me give you an intuitive idea of this. Think of the criminal justice example again, this idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, what would be the type 1 error? It'd be putting an innocent man in jail, right? The type 2 error would be letting a guilty person go free. Those are both mistakes, but they're different kinds of mistakes. The type 1 error we consider to be more severe because we don't want to put innocent people in jail. So you may say, well, I want to prevent that, so I'm going to design a legal system where if you get arrested and you go in front of a judge or a jury, you have to have 4 pieces of evidence to be convicted. You're going to have video footage, eyewitnesses, DNA, and a signed confession. Well, you can imagine then that we're not going to be putting away too many innocent people because that's a lot of evidence to have against an innocent man, right? Chances are you wouldn't be able to accumulate all that evidence against someone who is actually innocent. But as a result, though, lots of guilty people would probably go free, right, for crimes they actually committed because you wouldn't be able to gather all that evidence against everyone, right? So the fact is that you would increase the likelihood of the type 2 error by trying to avoid the type 1 error so strictly. On the other side of it, the flip side of the coin is, what if you had the opposite take? You say, well, I just really want to prevent guilty people getting away with crimes. So I'm going to make it so that if you end up arrested and end up in a courtroom, you don't get a jury. You basically just get a judge to sentence you, immediately, essentially. If you get arrested, you go straight to jail. No chance that you get to plead your case or provide evidence to the contrary, whatever, nothing. You get arrested, the cop says you did something, chances are you did do something, you're going to prison, right? If you had that policy in your legal system, you'd probably not let too many guilty people go free, right? Because if they ended up in your courtroom, they were on their way to jail, basically. So you wouldn't have that situation where you got a lot of guilty people going free, but you would have lots of innocent people going to jail, right? Because anyone that was, arrested for a crime that they didn't commit, they wouldn't even have a chance to defend themselves. They'd go immediately to jail. Lots of innocent people would end up in jail as a result. So you would increase the type 1 error dramatically by trying to tamp down the type 2 error so much. So it's kind of like a seesaw, right? You push down on type 1, you increase type 2, you push down on type 2, you increase type 1. So, how do you avoid that trade-off? Well, the way you avoid the trade-off is simply to increase the sample size at the same time you lower your significance level, right? So it turns out that increasing the sample size actually makes it less likely that you'll commit the type 2 error. So if you want to lower your significance level so you have a small chance of a type 1 error, and you don't want to have that dramatic increase in the type 2 error occur, you can just use a larger sample size, and that'll help offset that a little bit. Of course, you can actually offset it, as much as you want, depending on how large your sample is, right? But to figure that out, it's outside of the scope of our course. The type 2 error is like a function. You have to make some assumptions, and you can calculate for special cases. It's not that hard to do, but we're not going to worry about it in our course. So I just want you to know that essentially, if you try to reduce the likelihood of a type 1 error, you generally, if you don't change anything else, will increase the likelihood of a type 2 error. To offset that, you have to increase the sample size. So, right? But if you don't care about the type 2 error and you don't mind if it skyrockets, then you just drop alpha. Really simple, right? Make alpha 1% instead of 5% or instead of 10%. And if you want to, if you are worried about the type 2 error, you can then also decide to use a larger sample size in your study. So when you go out and collect sample, you take a bigger sample size to offset what's happening there when you lower the alpha to something so small. And that's basically it.